Welcome back to the Rare Books Club. Today, we're skipping the small talk because the text we are diving into pulls absolutely no punches. We're looking at Joerg Fisch's massive, completely fascinating study, Burning Women, a global history of widow sacrifice from ancient times to the present. Buckle up because we are unpacking one of the darkest, most universal, and yet rarely discussed practices in human history.
To set the stage, there's this really shocking account by a French traveler named Pierre Labarthe from way back in 1803. He basically says there can be nothing more barbaric than the ceremonies that followed the death of a king of Dahomey, noting how the wives of the dead king arrive in large numbers and vie with each other for the honor of being buried with him. You can practically feel him shuddering as he writes it. And that is exactly where Joerg Fisch starts us off. He sets out to explore a terrifying reality, how societies all over the planet have historically tied their ultimate expressions of power directly to human death. Now, what this book promises the reader is something truly ambitious. Fisch aims to map out this terrifying practice on a global scale. We're talking ancient Egypt and Sumer, the Americas, across Africa, into Oceania, China, and of course, India. He promises to take a practice that is historically universal across the globe, yet individually quite rare, and put it into a unified, totally objective context. And honestly, he absolutely pulls it off. But first, we really need to define our terms here. Fisch uses a very specific German concept that roughly translates to following into death. He defines it like this. After the death of a person, one or more persons follow him or her into death in a ritualized and public act, voluntarily or involuntarily. The absolute crucial point here is that this isn't about private grief. This is not some Romeo and Juliet situation where someone dies of a broken heart. No, the requirement is the ritualized public nature of the act. The community has to be watching, witnessing, and validating the deaths. That public audience is what gives the whole thing its social legitimacy.
What's really fascinating is the core framework Fisch builds to explain all this. He splits this massive global phenomenon into two distinct categories that almost never overlap. On the one hand, we have institutional following into death. This is all about political power and class. Think of an ancient king dying and taking 50 anonymous slaves, concubines, and guards to the grave with him. It is a massive, brutal flex of state power. On the other hand, you have individual following into death. This one is based on personal status and gender. This is the wife accompanying her husband, which strictly enforces a social and gender hierarchy. As Fisch points out, the king doesn't accompany the beggar, and the man doesn't accompany the woman. The direction of death always flows upward toward power. Let's do a quick deep dive into the book's actual construction and who it's really for. Honestly, this explainer of a book is for serious history buffs. The strengths are just undeniable. You get an unmatched global breadth and this incredibly unflinching objectivity. Fisch refuses to get bogged down in moralizing. He just clinically analyzes the mechanics of the custom. But we have to talk about the weaknesses too. The academic pacing is dense, like really heavy. Plus, just by the nature of history, he has to rely heavily on some very speculative early European accounts for places like the Americas and Africa. He readily admits you have to take those with a massive grain of salt.
To really see where this fits on your shelf, you kind of have to compare it to the heavyweights of the field. You might immediately think of James Fraser's famous work on human sacrifice in The Golden Brow, or maybe Emile Durkheim's writings on altruistic suicide. But Fisch brilliantly illustrates how following into death is its own completely distinct beast. Human sacrifice is about offering a life to a god to get a return, right? Like rain for the crops or victory in battle. Following into death is done entirely for a dead human being. It's quite literally just about keeping them company. It's a completely different social engine driving it.
And that brings us to the most agonizing question in the whole book, the illusion of free choice. Fisch shares this chilling account from an 1895 British medical officer named Richard Hartley Kennedy, who witnessed a widow immolation in Baroda, India. Kennedy actually secretly whispered to the widow that he could save her if she was afraid. And Kennedy notes in his record that her look of reply was quite sufficient. She had not come without counting the cost. She literally just walked to the pyre with this eerie, unshakable calmness. It completely short-circuits what you expect as an observer. Fisch uses stories like this not to validate the horror, but to objectively explore the terrifying reality of what happens when a society completely brainwashes an individual into believing this is their highest possible destiny. This ultimately leads to Fisch's most profound revelation. Why on earth do people do this? Well, Fisch points out there's a very specific type of religious belief required. There's this line where the author says, the next world is, in effect, a continuation or a copy of this world and not its contrasting image. Think about it.
If your religion says the afterlife flips the script, that the meek inherit the earth or the rich burn in hell, this practice dies out instantly. But if your society believes the afterlife is just an exact carbon copy of this world, well, then the king still needs his servants to chop wood, and the husband still needs his wife. So, where did this all begin? Fisch is remarkably blunt here. He admits right up front that the historical trail goes completely cold. We have absolutely no idea when or how this started. By the time it appears in written documents, whether we're looking at ancient China or texts from India, it's already a fully developed, highly structured institution. You simply can't reconstruct the origin from the archaeological record. You can only observe it once it is completely entrenched in the culture. Because the true origins are totally lost to time, societies actually just invented myths to justify the practice. And this brings us to the ancient myth of the poisoners. Writers like Diodorus from ancient Greece and later European writers recorded this widespread myth. At one point, the book puts it like this: earlier, the wives, out of lust, killed their husbands with poison. So the practice was started so that the wives may fear the death of their husbands, and ancient kings supposedly invented widow burning just to stop wives from poisoning their husbands. Fisch utterly destroys this logic. She points out that this is pure myth and it reflects a male obsession with controlling women's sexuality, rather than any actual, literal historical event. To see how weird this gets, consider the specific year 209 BC. This is when the Chinese state successfully suppressed institutional sacrifice. They finally stopped the mass killing of slaves and servants for dead rulers. But then, a crazy paradox happened. Because the elite stopped monopolizing the practice, individual widow suicide absolutely exploded across the general population. It became this bizarre way for regular, everyday families to claim prestige and honor, proving their loyalty beyond death. It just goes to show how incredibly resilient this dark custom is when it shifts from a strict political requirement to a personal point of honor.
Which brings me to my final verdict for today's explainer. I am giving Burning Women 4.5 out of 5 stars. My specific reasons: the sweeping global analysis is unparalleled. The unflinching objectivity really allows you to understand the terrifying logic behind the rituals without getting clouded by modern outrage. And the case studies, from the Nachas in North America to the Dahomey in Africa to the pyres in India, are just absolutely fascinating. My call is a definitive buy. If you are a serious history buff who wants a masterclass in global analysis, you absolutely need this on your shelf.
So I'm throwing it over to you. Knowing the incredibly heavy subject matter we just covered, is this massive global study something you would actually add to your reading list? It definitely leaves us with a chilling, lingering question. If a society can make the ultimate sacrifice feel like an honorable, willing duty, what seemingly unshakable norms do we just accept today without counting the cost? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know where you stand on this one. And if you enjoyed this explainer diving into the obscure and fascinating, make sure to subscribe to the Rare Books Club for more deep dives into texts you definitely won't find on the typical bestseller lists. See you next time.